Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 5 true disturbing stories from the remote corners of Nebraska. These are tales of people who ventured into forgotten farmland and abandoned prairie towns and found something they were never meant to see. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The Dunning property sat about 40 miles west of Broken Bow, right where the sandhills start getting serious. My uncle left it to me when he passed in 2019, and I'd been putting off dealing with it for almost 2 years. It wasn't that I didn't care. I just had no idea what to do with 160 acres of prairie grass and a farmhouse that hadn't been lived in since the early 90s. My uncle had used it for hunting once or twice a year, but mostly it just sat there, the grass growing tall around it, collecting dust and memories I wasn't particularly interested in confronting. I finally drove out there on a Saturday in October. The weather was perfect. Mid-60s, clear sky, that kind of golden autumn light that makes everything look softer than it actually is. The gravel road leading to the property hadn't been maintained in years, and my truck bounced through ruts deep enough that I worried about my oil pan. When I finally pulled up to the house, I sat there for a minute with the engine running, just looking at it. White paint peeling in long strips, front porch sagging on one side, 3 windows on the second floor dark and empty. I brought my cousin's dog with me, a German shepherd named Bridger who was usually excited about everything. But when I opened the truck door, he didn't jump out like normal. He just sat there in the passenger seat, staring at the house with his ears pulled back. I thought maybe he just needed a minute to adjust, so I grabbed my duffel bag and walked up to the porch alone. The front door was unlocked. I'd expected that. My uncle wasn't the type to worry about security way out here. Inside, everything was exactly like I remembered from the one time I'd visited as a kid. Same floral couch, same dark wood paneling, same smell of old newspapers and dust. I walked through the living room and into the kitchen, and that's when I noticed the basement door was open. Not just unlocked, open, maybe 6 inches, enough that I could see darkness beyond it and the top few steps leading down. I told myself my uncle probably left it that way, or maybe the latch didn't catch properly and it had drifted open over the years. I pulled it shut and heard the latch click, then went back outside to try coaxing Bridger out of the truck. He wouldn't budge. I even got out his favorite ball and threw it across the yard, but he just watched it bounce through the tall grass and didn't move. Fine, I'd deal with him later. I spent the next hour walking the property line, trying to figure out what I was actually supposed to do with all this land. The grass was waist-high in places, thick and dry, rustling in the wind. There were old fence posts every 100 yards or so, most of them leaning at angles, wire long since rusted through. I found a collapsed outbuilding that might have been a chicken coop once. Found some rusted farm equipment half buried in the dirt. When I got back to the house, I was thirsty and my jeans were covered in burrs. I went inside, filled a glass from the kitchen tap. The water ran brown for a few seconds before clearing, and that's when I noticed the basement door was open again. Same 6 inches, same view of darkness and stairs. I stared at it for a long time. The house was completely still. No wind, no settling noises, nothing that would have pushed the door open. I walked over and examined the latch. It seemed fine. Clicked shut easily when I tested it. I closed the door again, made sure it latched, and stood there with my hand on the knob for maybe 30 seconds, just listening. Nothing. I went upstairs to check out the bedrooms. 2 of them were empty except for old furniture. The third one, my uncle's, had a bed with a bare mattress and a dresser with some of his things still in it. Hunting magazines, a pocket knife, some loose change. I sat on the edge of the bed and it creaked under my weight, and I realized I was exhausted. Not physically, I'd barely done anything all day, but exhausted in that deep way where your body just wants to shut down. I decided to stay the night. I don't know why. It felt stupid even as I was making the decision, but something about driving back to Lincoln right then felt wrong, like I'd be leaving something unfinished. I brought my sleeping bag in from the truck. Bridger still wouldn't get out, so I left him there with the windows cracked and set up in the living room on that floral couch. It was probably around 7 when the sun started setting, and I realized I hadn't seen any light switches that worked. The power had been shut off years ago. I'd brought a flashlight and a camping lantern, and I set the lantern on the coffee table and tried to read a book on my phone. Around 8:30 I heard it, a sound from below the floor. Not quite footsteps, more like something being dragged. A slow, grinding scrape that lasted maybe 5 seconds, then stopped. I sat up, listening. The house was silent except for the wind outside and the occasional creak of old wood settling. I told myself it was just the house making noises. Old places do that. Pipes expanding, foundation shifting, nothing unusual. Then I heard it again, the same grinding scrape, but longer this time and closer to the basement stairs. I got up and walked to the kitchen. The basement door was open. Wide open this time, pushed back against the wall like someone had walked through it. The darkness down there seemed thicker than it should be, like it was something solid pushing up from below. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it down the stairs. The beam didn't reach very far, maybe 8 or 10 steps before the light just seemed to get swallowed up. I could see rough concrete walls, exposed floor joists above, but I couldn't see the bottom. "Hello!" My voice sounded small and stupid. Nothing answered. I don't know what I was thinking, but I started down the steps. Not because I was brave, I was terrified, but because some part of my brain insisted I needed to know, that whatever was down there needed to be confronted or understood or at least identified. The air got colder as I descended. I counted 13 steps before I reached the bottom, and my flashlight beam finally found the basement floor. It was dirt. Packed earth that looked like it had never been finished with concrete. The ceiling was low enough that I had to duck my head to avoid the floor joists, and the space stretched out into darkness in both directions. I swept my flashlight left and saw old paint cans, some cardboard boxes disintegrating from moisture, what looked like the rusted frame of a bicycle. Then I swept it right. Someone was standing there. Not someone, something. At the far edge of my flashlight's reach, maybe 20 feet away, pale and thin and wrong. It stood completely still, and I couldn't tell if it was facing me or facing away because its head was bent at an angle no neck should bend. The arms hung too long, fingers nearly touching the dirt floor, and the shoulders, they were pulled back too far like the joints had been reversed. I took a step backward and my boot hit the bottom stair. The thing's head moved. Not like it was turning to look at me, it just twitched, a fast jerking motion, and stayed at that same impossible angle. I ran. Up the stairs, through the kitchen, out the front door. I didn't grab my sleeping bag or my duffel bag or anything. Just ran straight to my truck, and Bridger was barking now, standing up on the seat, and I shoved him over and got the engine started on the second try. I was halfway down that rusted gravel road before I realized I was still holding the flashlight, my knuckles white around it. I didn't go back for my stuff. I called a salvage company the next week and told them to take whatever they wanted from the house. Told them I didn't care what they found or what they did with it, just clear it out. They called me 2 days later and said they'd finished the job, but they wouldn't go in the basement, said the stairs were unsafe. I told them that was fine and signed the property over to the county for unpaid taxes a month later. Sometimes I still think about it, what I saw down there. If it's still standing in that basement, bent and pale in the darkness. Whether it was ever really there at all, or if something about that house just pulled it out of my head and gave it shape. But mostly I think about the basement door, how it kept opening, how it wanted me to see. Story 2. My girlfriend Sienna and I moved to Chadron in the spring of 2018 for her teaching job. It's a small town up in the northwest corner of Nebraska, right near the South Dakota border, and the landscape there is different from what most people picture when they think of Nebraska. It's not flat, it's all ridges and pine forests and these strange rock formations that look like something out of a Western movie. Beautiful in a stark, lonely way. We rented a house on the edge of town, and behind our property was maybe 100 yards of scrub grass before the tree line started. Beyond that was state forest land, thousands of acres of it, stretching north all the way to the Pine Ridge. Sienna loved it. She'd grown up in Omaha and never really had access to wild spaces like that, so she'd go hiking every weekend, sometimes for hours. I went with her the first few times, but I'm not much of a hiker. My knees are bad, and I don't like being that far from cell service. So after a while, she started going alone. I didn't love the idea, but she was careful, always brought her phone or whistle water, told me exactly where she was going. The third weekend of June, she went out around noon and said she'd be back by 4. She was planning to follow one of the established trails up to a viewpoint she'd heard about from one of her coworkers. Easy hike, maybe 6 miles round trip. 4 o'clock came and went. By 5, I was texting her. No response. By 6, I was calling and it went straight to voicemail. At 7, with the sun starting to sink, I got in my car and drove to the trailhead. Her car was still there, only car in the lot. I grabbed a flashlight from my trunk and started up the trail. It was well marked, easy to follow, and I kept thinking I'd run into her coming back down. Maybe she'd lost track of time. Maybe her phone died. Simple explanations. I didn't find her on the trail. I made it all the way to the viewpoint, a rocky outcrop overlooking miles of forest, and she wasn't there. The sun was nearly gone by then, just a thin line of orange on the horizon, and I stood there scanning the trees below, trying to figure out what to do. Call the police, keep searching, go back and get help. That's when I heard her voice. Marcus, faint, coming from somewhere off the trail to my left, down the slope, deeper into the trees. Sienna, I shouted back. Marcus, I'm stuck, I need help. Her voice sounded strange, flat almost, but it was definitely her voice, and she sounded calm, not panicked, which made me think maybe she just twisted an ankle or something. I left the trail and started picking my way down the slope, using my flashlight to navigate through the pines. Keep talking so I can find you, I called out. I'm here, Marcus, just follow my voice. I kept walking, branches scraping against my jacket, my boots slipping on loose pine needles. The slope was steeper than it looked, and I had to grab onto tree trunks to keep from sliding. Where are you? I asked. Right here. Her voice was closer now, maybe 30 feet ahead, though I couldn't see anything but trees. I pushed through a thick stand of pines and came out into a small clearing. My flashlight beam swept across it. Empty, just dead grass and a fallen log. Sienna, I'm here. Her voice came from behind me now. I spun around and my flashlight caught movement between the trees. A figure, pale and quick, darting out of sight. Not Sienna, too tall, moving wrong. Marcus, why won't you help me? The voice was still hers, but it was coming from a different direction now. Off to my right, maybe 20 feet away, somewhere in the darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. I started backing up, and my boot caught on something and I went down hard on my back. The flashlight flew out of my hand and landed a few feet away, the beam pointing uselessly at the sky. I scrambled for it and got my hand around it just as I heard footsteps. Not running, walking, slow and deliberate, coming from multiple directions. Footsteps in the dry grass and pine needles circling the clearing. I pointed the flashlight toward the sound and saw it. Pale skin stretched over bones, arms too long hanging past the knees, no face, just smooth skin where a face should be, featureless except for a slight depression where a mouth might have been. It stopped when the light hit it. Stood there, swaying slightly like it was deciding something. Marcus, The voice came from it, Sienna's voice, perfect mimicry. "Why are you being like this?" I ran straight back up the slope, not caring about the trail, just needing to get away from that voice and that thing. I fell twice, scraped my hands raw on rocks and roots, but I didn't stop. I could hear movement behind me, something keeping pace, branches snapping. I don't remember getting back to the parking lot. One moment I was crashing through the forest, and the next I was at my car, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. I drove straight to the police station, told them everything. They organized a search party and went out with dogs and spotlights, and they found Sienna 2 hours later. She was sitting on a rock about a quarter mile from where I'd been, confused and cold but unharmed. She said she'd wandered off the trail trying to get a better view of something, got turned around and couldn't find her way back before it got dark. She'd been calling for help, but her voice was hoarse and she didn't think anyone could hear her. She didn't remember calling my name, didn't remember saying she was stuck. The search team didn't find anything else. No footprints except ours, no sign of what I'd seen in that clearing. We moved back to Omaha 3 months later. Sienna got a job at a school there, and we told everyone it was for better opportunities. But really, neither of us could stand being near those woods anymore. Even though she didn't remember what happened, or says she doesn't, I think some part of her knows. Because sometimes, late at night when we're both lying in bed trying to sleep, I hear her whisper my name. And when I turn to look at her, her eyes are closed. She's asleep. But her lips are still moving, forming words in a voice that sounds like hers but isn't quite right. And I pretend I don't notice. Story 3. I took a job with a survey crew the summer I turned 23. It was good money and I needed it. Student loans were crushing me, and my degree in environmental science wasn't opening as many doors as I'd hoped. The work was straightforward enough. Drive to remote locations, set up equipment, take measurements, mark boundaries. Most of it was farmland in the eastern part of the state, but occasionally we'd get contracts for more isolated areas. In August, we got assigned a property near Lawrence. I'd never heard of Lawrence, most people haven't. It's barely a town, more like a cluster of houses that someone decided to put a name to. The property was about 15 miles south of there, an old homestead that was being divided up for sale. Our job was to mark the new property lines and document any structures. There were 4 of us on the crew: me, my supervisor Derek, and 2 other surveyors named Yolanda and Trent. We drove out there on a Wednesday morning, 2 trucks carrying equipment and supplies for what we figured would be a 3-day job. The property was big, almost 400 acres, and most of it was overgrown prairie with patches of cottonwood trees. The homestead itself sat in a shallow depression about a mile from the road. There was a main house, partially collapsed, and 3 outbuildings in various states of decay. The place had been abandoned since the 60s, according to the property records, and it looked every year of it. Windows broken out, roof sagging, tall grass pushing up through the floorboards of the porch. We set up our base camp near the trucks and spent the first day working the northern section of the property. Everything was normal. Hot sun, occasional breeze, the usual back and forth on the radios about measurements and coordinates. We finished around 6 and drove back to Beatrice, where we were staying at a motel. The second day, Derek wanted to document the structures, take photos, note their condition, mark them on the survey map. Yolanda and Trent started with the outbuildings while Derek and I approached the main house. The front door was missing, just an empty doorframe leading into darkness. Derek went in first, camera in hand, and I followed with my clipboard and flashlight. The interior was pretty much what you'd expect: water damage, mold, debris everywhere. There was still furniture in some of the rooms, buried under decades of dust and dead leaves that had blown in through the broken windows. We were in the kitchen when Derek stopped and pointed at the floor. "You see that?" I looked down. There was a trapdoor, mostly hidden under a collapsed section of cabinet. It had a metal ring for a handle. "Root cellar, probably," I said. Derek grabbed the ring and pulled. The door didn't budge at first, then came free with a screech of rusted hinges. Cold air rushed up from below, bringing with it a smell that made my eyes water. Not quite rotting meat, but something organic and wrong. "Jesus," Derek coughed and stepped back. "That's foul." We both stood there looking down into the darkness. My flashlight didn't reveal much, just earthen walls and what might have been the top of a ladder. "We should document it," Derek said, though he didn't sound enthusiastic. "I'll go," I offered, mostly because I was younger and felt like I had to prove something. I sat down on the edge of the opening and found the ladder rungs with my feet. They seemed solid enough, so I started climbing down, my flashlight tucked under my arm. It was maybe 12 feet to the bottom, and when I stepped off the ladder, my boots sank slightly into soft earth. The cellar was bigger than I expected, maybe 15 feet square, with a ceiling just high enough that I didn't have to duck. The walls were hard-packed earth, and there were wooden shelves along one side, most of them collapsed. Broken jars scattered everywhere, glass glinting in my flashlight beam. Then I saw the marks, scratches covering the walls, deep gouges in the earth like something had been clawing at them. They were everywhere on all 4 walls, extending from about waist height down to the floor. Some of them were so deep my fingers could fit into the grooves. "Derek," I called up, "you should see this." His face appeared in the opening above. "See what?" "These marks, all over the walls." He came down the ladder, and we both stood there examining them with our flashlights. The scratches weren't random. They formed patterns, long vertical lines, always in groups of 4 or 5, like fingers dragging down the earth. "Animal maybe," Derek suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. "What animal claws at dirt walls in a root cellar?" We were about to head back up when I noticed something else. In the far corner, partially buried in the soft earth of the floor. I walked over and knelt down, brushing away the dirt. It was a shoe, a small leather shoe, the kind a child would wear. Old, the leather was cracked and stiff, but not as old as the house, maybe from the 70s or 80s, just the one shoe, nothing else. Derek and I looked at each other. Neither of us said anything, but I think we were both thinking the same thing. We climbed out of that cellar fast, and Derek took a few photos from the opening but didn't go back down. We finished documenting the house and got out of there. Regrouped with Yalander and Trent, told them what we'd found. Trent wanted to see it, but Derek shut that down quick, said we'd done what we needed to do and there was no reason to go back. That night at the motel, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those scratches, about the shoe, about the smell that had come up when we opened that trapdoor. The next morning, we went back to finish the survey. We had maybe 4 hours of work left on the southern boundary. We were all quiet, working efficiently, wanting to be done. Around 11, Trent radioed that he'd found something. We drove over to where he was standing near the tree line and he pointed at the ground. More scratches, not on walls this time, carved into a flat piece of limestone partially buried in the grass. The same pattern. Long vertical lines in groups of 4 or 5, covering the entire surface of the rock. "There's another one over there," Yolanda said, pointing to a second limestone slab about 30 feet away. We found 7 more before we stopped looking, all of them with the same marks, all of them forming a rough circle around the homestead. Derek made the call to finish up fast and get out. We worked through lunch, packed our equipment by 2, and were on the road by 3. Nobody talked much on the drive back to Beatrice. I quit the survey crew 2 weeks later. Told Derek it just wasn't for me, that I'd found something else. That was mostly true. I did find another job, but really I just couldn't shake the feeling that we'd seen something we weren't supposed to see, that we de-documented something that should have stayed buried. A few months later, I looked up the property records for that homestead. According to what I could find, the family that lived there in the 50s had a daughter who disappeared in 1957. She was 8 years old. They never found her, and the family moved away shortly after. The property sold last year. Someone's building a house there. I wonder sometimes if they know what's buried under that field. If they've found those scratched stones. If they've opened the root cellar. Story 4. My grandmother lived in Minden, a small town in south-central Nebraska, and I visited her every few months when I was in college. She'd lived alone since my grandfather died, and my parents worried about her, so I'd drive down from Lincoln, spend the weekend, help with yard work or whatever needed doing. It was never a burden. I liked Minden. Quiet, simple, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and nothing much ever happened. In October of my senior year, I drove down for what I thought would be a normal visit. My grandmother seemed fine on the phone, but when I arrived Friday evening, she looked tired. Older than I remembered, though it had only been 6 weeks since I'd seen her. "I haven't been sleeping well," she admitted when I asked. "There's been a sound at night. I can't figure out where it's coming from." "What kind of sound?" "Tapping on the window in the spare bedroom. The one you sleep in." The spare bedroom was on the 2nd floor, at the back of the house. There was a large maple tree close to that side of the building, and I figured that was the obvious answer. "Probably just branches," I said. "That's what I thought, but I trimmed them back 3 weeks ago. They're not close enough to touch the window anymore." I went upstairs to look. The room was exactly how I remembered it: floral wallpaper, a twin bed with a quilted comforter, an old dresser with a mirror. I opened the window and looked out. She was right, the nearest branches were at least 6 feet away, too far to reach the glass. "I'll keep an ear out tonight," I told her. "If I hear anything, I'll figure out what it is." We had dinner and watched TV, and I went to bed around 11. The house was quiet except for the usual sounds: pipes creaking, the furnace clicking on and off, floorboards settling. I read for a while on my phone, then turned off the light and tried to sleep. The tapping started just after midnight, soft at first. 3 quick taps on the window glass, then silence. I lay there in the dark listening. Maybe 30 seconds passed, then 3 more taps, deliberate, evenly spaced. I got up and went to the window, looked out at the backyard. The maple tree was visible in the moonlight, branches swaying slightly in the breeze, but none of them were close enough to touch the glass. I pressed my face against the window, trying to see if there was something on the wall below, a loose shutter or piece of trim that might be knocking against the siding. Nothing. The tapping came again, 3 knocks right next to where my face was pressed against the glass. I jerked back. My heart was hammering now, and I stood there in the dark room staring at the window. Moonlight illuminated the glass, showing me my own faint reflection and nothing else. Then I saw the marks on the outside of the window, smudges in the dust and pollen that coated the glass. 5 vertical lines like fingers, and they were exactly where the tapping had been. I turned on the light and examined the window more carefully. The marks were definitely there. They looked like someone had pressed their hand against the glass from outside, but we were on the 2nd floor, at least 14 feet above the ground. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the chair by the dresser with the light on, watching the window. The tapping didn't come back, but I kept thinking about those marks, about something pressed against the glass, knocking. In the morning, I went outside with a ladder and climbed up to check the window from the outside. The handprint was still there, clearly visible in the daylight, but there was something else too, more marks, all over that side of the house. Dozens of handprints on the siding, on the window frames, on the trim below the roof. All of them about 14 feet off the ground. All of them placed too high for someone on a ladder to reach comfortably. "How long has this been happening?" I asked my grandmother. 3 weeks, she said, "since the middle of September." "Did you see anything? Anyone around the house?" She shook her head. Just the tapping, every night. I spent that day trying to figure it out. I checked the tree again, definitely couldn't reach. I looked for signs that someone had been using a lift or ladder, no marks in the grass, no disturbance. I even drove into town and asked at the hardware store if anyone had reported similar issues. Nothing. That night I stayed awake again, set up in the spare bedroom with the light off, phone ready to call the police if I saw anything. The tapping started at 12:15, 3 knocks. Pause, 3 more knocks. I stayed seated watching the window, waiting. Then I saw it. A face pressed against the glass, pale and wrong. The eyes were too far apart, the mouth too wide, and the skin had a waxy texture that didn't look real. It stared in at me for maybe 3 seconds, and then it smiled. The mouth opened impossibly wide, showing teeth that were too long and too numerous, and it tapped on the glass 3 more times with fingers that had too many joints. I screamed, couldn't help it, just a reflexive sound of pure terror. The face pulled back from the window and disappeared. I ran downstairs and called the police. 2 officers came out within 20 minutes, and we all went around back with flashlights. We searched the yard, the tree, the side of the house. Found nothing except those handprints on the siding. The officers were polite but clearly skeptical. One of them suggested it might be kids with a projector or some kind of prank. The other one said sometimes people see things when they're half asleep that aren't really there. I didn't argue. What was I going to say? My grandmother and I stayed up the rest of the night in the living room, lights on, both of us too scared to go back upstairs. In the morning, I packed up her things and drove her to my parents' house in Lincoln. She never went back to that house in Minden. My parents hired a property management company to pack up her belongings, and they sold the place within 2 months. The new owners tore it down and built something modern on the lot. I looked at photos online after it was finished, all glass and clean lines, nothing like the old house. I wonder sometimes if they've heard tapping at night. If they've seen handprints on the windows 14 feet above the ground, if they've seen the face. I told myself for years it was stress, sleep deprivation, maybe some kind of hallucination brought on by fear. But last month, I was scrolling through social media and saw a post from someone in Minden. They were asking if anyone else had experienced strange occurrences in their neighborhood. Said they kept hearing tapping on their second-floor windows at night. 13 people commented saying they'd heard it too. I didn't respond. I just closed the app and tried not to think about all those faces pressed against glass in the dark. All those too wide mouths smiling. All those fingers with too many joints tapping out their patient rhythm. Story 5. I moved to Valentine in the spring of 2020, right before everything shut down. It wasn't a choice. I'd lost my job in Denver and my lease was up, and my brother Quinn had an extra room in his house up there. Valentine sits in the northern part of Nebraska, right on the edge of the Sandhills National Forest, and it's the kind of place where you can drive for an hour and see maybe 3 other cars. Quinn worked for the Forest Service, and his house was about 7 miles outside of town on a gravel road that cut through rolling prairie. Isolated, but I didn't mind. I was planning to look for remote work anyway, and the quiet was nice after years of city noise. Things were fine at first. Quinn and I got along well, and I spent most of my time applying for jobs and going on long walks through the hills. The landscape out there is strange. All grass and sand, punctuated by these dark stands of pine that seem to appear out of nowhere. It's beautiful in an empty way, but there's something about it that feels off. Like the land is too big and you're too small, and something about that ratio isn't quite right. In June, Quinn had to leave for a week-long training in Omaha. He apologized for the timing, but I told him it was fine. I'd gotten used to being alone in the house, and honestly, I was looking forward to having the place to myself. He left on a Monday morning, and I watched his truck disappear down the gravel road until the dust settled. Then I went inside and made coffee and sat on the back porch looking out at the hills. That first day and night were completely normal. I worked, made dinner, watched a movie on my laptop, went to bed around 11 and slept fine. The second night, I woke up around 2 in the morning to use the bathroom. On my way back to bed, I walked past the window in the hallway and glanced outside. There was someone standing in the yard. I stopped, my hand on the doorframe, and stared. The figure was maybe 40 feet from the house, just standing there in the moonlight, tall and motionless, facing toward me. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette against the pale grass. My first thought was that someone's car had broken down and they'd walked to the nearest house for help. I went downstairs and turned on the porch light, and when I looked out again, the figure was gone. I stood there for a long time, scanning the yard. Nothing moved. No one called out. I told myself I'd imagined it, shadows playing tricks, my eyes adjusting to the dark, and went back to bed. The next night, I woke up again around 2. I don't know what woke me this time, no sound, just a sudden awareness that I was awake and something was wrong. I lay there in the dark for maybe a minute before I got up and walked to the hallway window. The figure was closer, maybe 20 feet from the house now, standing in the same spot I'd last seen it. Same posture, completely still, facing the window. I didn't turn on the porch light this time. I just stood there, my mouth dry, watching, trying to make out details. Height maybe 6.5 feet, thin or at least narrow, arms hanging straight down. I don't know how long I watched. Could have been 30 seconds, could have been 5 minutes. At some point I realized I was holding my breath and I forced myself to inhale. When I blinked, the figure was gone, not walked away. Just gone, empty yard, grass swaying in the breeze. I called Quinn the next morning, tried to sound casual, asked if they'd had any problems with trespassers or people wandering onto the property. He said no, never, and asked why I was asking. I told him I thought I'd seen someone in the yard, and he said it was probably a deer. People mistake them for humans all the time in low light. I didn't tell him I'd seen it 2 nights in a row. I didn't tell him it had been closer the second time. That night I stayed up, made coffee and sat in the living room with all the lights off, watching the yard through the window. I'd set up my phone to record video, though I wasn't sure what I expected to capture. At 2:07 a.m. the figure appeared, 10 feet from the house this time, close enough that I could see it more clearly. It was pale, not albino pale, but a grayish white that looked wrong in the moonlight. The proportions were off. Legs too long, arms too long, head too small for the body. And it was looking directly at the window where I sat. I didn't move, just sat there frozen, my heart slamming against my ribs, watching it watch me. My phone was recording on the windowsill, the camera pointed out at the yard. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement, like it was curious. Then it raised one hand and pressed it against the window screen. I could hear the metal mesh creaking, could see the long fingers spreading against it, too many joints in each finger, the tips ending in something that wasn't quite nails. I ran straight upstairs to Quinn's room, locked the door, and called 911. The dispatcher asked what my emergency was, and I tried to explain, but I was breathing too hard and the words came out jumbled. She said she'd send a deputy, but it would be at least 30 minutes given how far out we were. I stayed in that room until I heard the deputy knocking on the front door. When I came downstairs and let him in, he searched the property with his flashlight, checked the perimeter, looked at the window screens, walked around the yard. He didn't find anything, no footprints, no damage to the screens, no sign anyone had been there. He asked if I was on any medication, if I'd been drinking. I said no to both, and he nodded like he believed me, but also like he'd heard this kind of thing before. He gave me his card and told me to call if I saw anything else. I packed a bag and drove into Valentine that night. Got a motel room and didn't go back to Quinn's house until he returned from Omaha 4 days later. I showed him the video from my phone. We sat on his couch and watched it together. You could see the yard in the moonlight. You could see the dark shape of something standing there. But the resolution was too low to make out details, and after a few seconds the shape was just gone. No movement, just there, then not there. Quinn watched it 3 times, And then he said, "Dear." I didn't argue. What was the point? I'd seen what I'd seen and no video was going to prove it. I moved out 2 weeks later, told Quinn I'd found a job in Kansas City that required me to be on site. That wasn't true. I'd found remote work and could have lived anywhere. I just couldn't stay in that house anymore. Couldn't stand the idea of being alone out there with all that empty land and the things that stand in it at night. Sometimes I think about the pattern, how it got closer each night, how on the 4th night it was touching the window. I think about what would have happened if I'd stayed a 5th night, if it would have been inside. Quinn still lives there. I called him last month and he said everything's fine, the house is fine, nothing strange has happened, but he also mentioned he's been having trouble sleeping. Said he keeps waking up around 2 in the morning and can't figure out why. I didn't tell him to look out the window. I just said I hoped he felt better soon and ended the call. Because some part of me knows that if he looks, he'll see it, and it'll be closer now, right up against the glass, fingers spread, head tilted, watching, waiting, learning. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.